putting, I suppose, our adult ladies' education at the forefront, and for also being our brave ambassador to start our other conversation rolling, and also really for being a real asset in our shul. And I will thank you very much, Shira, for making the time and for treating us to a lovely share. I'm sure it's a lovely share this evening. I'm going to make you the host, if I remember how to do it, which I have been prompted to do. And then we really look forward to hearing a very nice share. Does that work? Shira, have you got it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm now the host.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to mute myself, and thank you, Shira. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Robertson, for a very nice introduction. Just before we start, I just wanted to fill everyone in on something that's just going on at the moment in Israel. I just got off the phone to a friend, and so her rabbi is called Rav Chidram. He's the Rav of her shul, and he was out today, and he came back in the afternoon, and his wife was out. He was expecting her to be in. She's normally in them, but she wasn't there. Didn't think anything of it. And then later in the day, she still wasn't back, and he tried calling her, and he couldn't get through to her. So he's getting a bit worried by now. And then when it got towards evening and he still hadn't heard from her, he started calling around friends and family, and nobody's heard from her. So by this point, he was like really getting very worried. And then his phone started ringing, and he recognized the number. It was this Arab builder he's had working for him, a guy called Iman. And so he answered the phone and just said to him, I'm really sorry, but I can't speak at the moment. I'm in the middle of something. And then the guy, the builder, said to him, I just want to speak to you for a minute. I just wanted to let you know I'm not going to be there in 3 days' time. I'm going to be at my uncle's wedding. So I can't come to work that day. So Rav Chidram said to him, it's fine, don't worry about it. I can't speak now, just in the middle of something. And then the builder said to him, but don't you want to know who my uncle's marrying? He's like, what are you talking about? I don't even know your uncle. So then he says to him, well, actually, you do know my uncle. I never told you before, but actually my uncle is Ayatollah Khomeini. And a few days ago, last week, he called me because he knows I live in Gaza and I work in Israel. He asked me to kidnap a Jewish woman for him, and that he was going to marry her. So I know why you're in a hurry to get off the phone. You've been looking for your wife, haven't you? He's like, what are you talking about? So he said, well, this afternoon, earlier in the day when you were out, I took your wife and I drove her into Gaza, and now we've got her, and she's going to be marrying my uncle in 3 days, and there's nothing you can do about it. If anyone comes in, anyone from the army, Mossad, don't get busy with it. We've got, all of our weapons, all of our missiles headed right for you if anyone steps in and does anything. So they haven't put any of this in the news yet, but because obviously they're probably working on trying something. But in the meantime, the Rabbonim have asked for people to please daven for this woman. So I'm just going to put her name on the screen. She's called Esther Bas Avichail. So if people can please daven for Esther Bas Avichail and have her in mind in your tefillos, because she's in a very scary situation. Don't worry, I'm messing with you. So by now you've probably realized, you'll recognize the name. Esther Bas Avichail is of course our Esther from our Purim story. And the reason I started with such a dramatic story is because we're used to talking about Purim as a very exciting Yom Tov, and it's the one that our kids love and they get all excited about, and it's dressing up and it's Shlach Manos, and it's it's an amazing Yom Tov for us where we celebrate, because whenever we think about it, we're thinking about it from the point of view of the Jewish people, and we're part of the Jewish people, and for us it was an amazing story. Yet again, we were about to be destroyed, and then as always happens to us, Hashem came and saved us. So it was a really exciting time for us, so we celebrate. But tonight I wanted to look at the story from a different point of view, from the point of view of Esther, so that we can think about what she went through, because I think for her it's not actually such a happy story. And so we're going to have a look at the story from her point of view in a bit more detail tonight. So we know the beginning of the story. There was a king called Ahasuerus, and he was the king of a place called Babylon or Bovel. And it was a massive kingdom. They'd taken over loads of the world. It was the biggest kingdom at the time. And he had inherited his kingdom from another king called Nebuchadnezzar. And we all know Nebuchadnezzar was the king who attacked the Jewish people, that he came into Eretz Israel, he broke down the walls of Jerusalem, he sent us all into exile, and he destroyed our Beis HaMikdash. So I wanted to give you a contemporary example of what that would feel like. So, you know, imagine she was a Jewish woman. She'd grown up from in the home of Mordechai, who was the head of the Sanhedrin. So, you know, a big, well-known Rav. And she was taken and captured and forced to marry literally the equivalent of Ayatollah Khomeini. Yeah, Ahasuerus was the king of the kingdom who had attacked us and sent us all into exile. That was the Golos that we were living in at the time. And so we all know how the story goes. He made a big feast to celebrate the fact that he thought it was the end of this 70 years that had been prophesied that we would be in exile for. And as it turned out, he miscalculated, because he was calculating from the time that the first group of Jews went into exile, whereas really our 70 years starts from the time that the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, which was a little later on. So he throws this big feast, he gets a bit carried away, a bit drunk, and he tries to embarrass his wife Vashti. She's having none of it, refuses to go along with it, and he says, off with her head, and he kills her. So what happens next? We know he holds this huge beauty pageant with all of the lovely women from all over his kingdom, and lo and behold, the one who's chosen is our friend Esther. So I'm going to cut to the bit where we're first introduced to Esther. This is Perek base of the Megillah, and this is our introduction to both Mordechai and to Esther. So it starts like this: Ish Yehudi haya b'Shushan habira ish Mordechai ben Yair ben Shimi ben Kish ish Yemini. So in this place called Shushan, which was the capital, there was a man called Mordechai. He was the son of Yair ben Shimi ben Kish, and he was from the tribe of Benjamin. And then the Megillah at this point, it gives us quite a lot of information about Mordechai, which gives us an insight into him, but it also places our story historically by setting the context for how this whole story took place. So it carries on to say, Asher hogla mirushalayim im hagola asher hogla sa im Yechonya melech Yehuda, asher hegla Nebuchadnezzar melech Bavel. So Mordechai, who had been exiled from Jerusalem in the group that was carried into exile, along with King Yechonya of Yehuda, which had been driven into exile by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. So it explains that there was an initial party, an initial group that went out first. And this was all the important people. That's why the king of Yehuda was in this group, King Yechonya, and Mordechai was in this group. So it's showing us already who Mordechai was. He's not just some random guy that no one's ever heard of. He was like a really choshev, prominent person. He was one of the important people. He was part of this group that actually physically it links the story to what had happened previously in Israel, because the Megillah actually starts in Bovel, but if you think of the context of when this is happening, it's immediately after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. So it shows you that Mordechai is part of this group he was there, he witnessed it, and he went into exile. And then it carries on to say that he was the foster father to Hadassah, that is Esther, who was his uncle's daughter. So Esther's his first cousin. So this is our introduction to Esther. For she had neither father nor mother. And then it carries on to say the maiden was shapely and beautiful, as they often are. And when her father and mother died, Mordechai adopted her as his own daughter. So again, we get lots of information here about Esther. So apart from that, she was beautiful, clearly an asset in Ahasuerus' eyes. As well as this, we see her relationship to Mordechai. So she's his first cousin, and it repeatedly tells us she had neither father nor mother. And then again draws our attention to it. It says when her father and mother died, Mordechai adopted her as his own daughter. So he's a very nice guy, what a mensch. So he had this cousin who had no parents, and he adopted her as his own daughter. Okay, so bear in mind the part in red that I highlighted for you for later on. So that's the context of when this story is taking place and who Mordechai was. But I'm now going to have a further look into the parts in blue about her neither having father nor mother, and that he adopted her as his own daughter. So let's see. Medrash Rabbah on Esther says like this. So why does it repeat that she neither had the father nor mother, and also that her mother and father died? So it explains that in halacha, a woman becomes a mother at birth, but a man becomes a father at conception. So by repeating that she never had either mother nor father, it's not just telling us that now she doesn't have parents, it's telling us that she never ever had any parents, because so now I'm reading in the red that her mother was pregnant when her father died. So her father died at conception, and when she was born, her mother died. So in halacha, she never had any parents because she lost her father at conception and her mother at birth. So she was an orphan from the very first. So again, this tells us a little bit about Esther. And then we can have a look further at her relationship with Mordechai. So this is following Rashi, who follows the Gemara. This is just an opinion, but it's a fairly well held of opinion, that not only did he adopt her as a daughter, as well as taking her on when she was young and she became his daughter, she grew up in his home, but then later on when she became an adult, Rashi says, don't read it as vas, but rather read it as vayis. He took her on as a house or a household. So our rabbis explain that bas here doesn't mean daughter, but actually means that she became his wife. So he married her as well. So this gives us quite a different perspective on her relationship with Mordechai. Not only was he her adoptive father, she actually married him, and also puts the whole Esther story in a different light, because I think a lot of us have been brought up thinking of Esther as like a very young, you know, in my mind, she was always like a teenager or a very young girl, maybe in her 20s. But actually, although she was swept up along with all these young maidens and young virgins, she actually was neither. She wasn't that young. According to the Gemara, she was, well, there's a few different opinions, but either she was 40 or she was 80 or somewhere in between, maybe 75, something like that. So she's not that young. And she actually was a married lady, and not just a married lady. She was married to the Gadol Hadar, to Mordechai. So, okay, so now we know that he looked after her, he married her, and then she gets taken along with all these women. And while she's there in the palace, we're told that she doesn't ever reveal who she really is. It's a well-kept secret. So it says back to the Megillah now, Esther still didn't reveal her kindred or her people, as Mordechai had instructed her. And then in blue, for Esther obeyed Mordechai's bidding as she had done while she was under his tutelage. So you could read this in its literal sense to mean that you know, she listened to him in terms of not revealing who she was, just like she always listened to him when she lived with him. But we're going to go one step further. Sorry. And the Gemara Megillah actually gives a different insight into this, which is, if you haven't heard it before, actually quite shocking. So the verse states, for Esther adhered to the words of Mordechai as she did when she was brought up with him. And so one of the Rabbanim says, this teaches us that she would show discharges of her menstrual blood to the sages to inquire whether she was pure or impure. So what does it mean that she was continued as she always had when she was brought up with him? She was still keeping to halacha, even though she was trapped in a palace and was taken against her will. She was still asking all her shilas to the Rabbanim. And it goes even further in red. The verse continues, as she did when she was brought up with him. Rabbi Bar Lima said that this means she maintained a relationship with Mordechai, as she would rise from the lap of Achashverosh, then immerse herself in a mikveh, in a ritual bath, and then sit in the lap of Mordechai. So again, this puts their whole relationship in a very different light. So not only was she Mordechai's wife, but this whole time, while she was in the palace and at the beck and call of Achashverosh, she was totally there against her will. She had no choice in it. Yet she was still trying to be the dutiful wife, the Rebbetzin of the Gadol Hadar, And she was still trying to maintain her relationship with her husband Mordechai. So she was still asking all her shaylos, she was still going to mikveh. And then whenever she could, she would escape back to her husband Mordechai. And, you know, you can imagine she's like leading this double life. It must have really been very difficult for her, you know, emotionally, psychologically. You know, she's basically married to the biggest Gadol Hadar and the biggest Russia all at the same time, and having to kind of, you know, go from one to the other and maintain both relationships because she just had no choice. So quite incredible of her. What happens next? So the next thing that happens is that this whole Haman story takes place. So we find Esther, Mordechai finds out that he's plotting to kill the Jews. Mordechai finds out about this and he wears sackcloth and he goes into mourning because he's obviously very worried about the situation. And then Esther finds out about what's happening because she sees him prancing around in front of the palace in his mourning clothes. And she gets a message from Mordechai asking her to go to the king and to beg for the lives of her people. Basically, Mordechai says to her, you know, finally, there's maybe going to be some advantage to you being in this awful situation. You know, you're actually the queen. And, you know, I've just found out that our lives are on the line here. You know, there's a national crisis. The Jewish people are about to be wiped out. And you're actually in prime position to put in a word in your other husband's ear and ask for us to be saved. And basically, the lives of all the Jewish people rely on you, like no pressure, but really, would you mind just having a little chat with him and seeing what you can sort out? So what does she say back to him? She explains that actually, much as she would love to help him, and, you know, she's also obviously very horrified at the situation, she explains she's not just allowed to turn up there. She has to wait to be summoned because, you know, even though she's married to him, he's very much a dictator. And, you know, she's not just allowed to turn up whenever she wants. She has to wait to be summoned. And she hasn't been summoned now for about 30 days. So the odds are he's probably going to call her soon. And so she'd feel a lot better about just waiting till he calls her because, you know, you don't really know what's going to happen with him. If you just turn up unannounced and he doesn't want to see you, then, you know, it could be that he just chops her head off as well. You know, he's got form for that. That's what he did to his first wife. She's legitimately quite worried that he might do that to her as well. So I can understand not wanting to go. And yet, on the other hand, you think like there's a national emergency here, all the Jewish people are about to be wiped out, and you're very clearly the person in the best position to help them. Yes, it's a risk, but why is she so reluctant to go? You know, you would have thought, you know, she'd think about it a bit, but then, you know, she's playing it safe and it's just like, no, I'm just going to wait and like not put myself out there because I'd rather just wait to see if he calls me. And then what happens next? So Mordechai replies to her like this. It's a bit harsh what he says to her. He has this message delivered to her. He says, Esther, do not imagine that you, of all the Jews, will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. On the contrary, if you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, while you and your father's house will perish. And who knows, maybe you have attained a royal position for just such a crisis. So it's a bit strange what he says to her. So let's try and unpack that a little bit. He says to her, you know what, I'm actually not that worried about the Jews. You know, this always happens to us, like every Yom Tov we've ever had. It's all about someone trying to kill us. And then in the end, we survive and Hashem saves us because that's what he does. Like he loves us. He's there for us. He's going to save us. He promised Avram that this is always going to happen to us. We're always going to be persecuted. We're always going to be a small nation, but that will always survive. So actually, you know, I'm saying to you that relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter. I'm not actually that worried about them. But if you keep silent, then you and your father's house will perish. So why does he say this to her? It doesn't really make any sense. If he says Hashem's going to save everyone, then why should she and her father's house perish? Why is he saying that to her? And then I've got another question on this based on the part in green. It's a bit of it doesn't quite make sense what he says. He says, who knows, perhaps you've attained a royal position for just such a crisis. So he's now saying to her like this, you know what, this Purim story, although it when we read it, it only takes 40 minutes. This is actually taking place over 11 or 12 years. So it's actually a really long time. At this point, she's now been married to Ahasuerus for 5 years. So it's not just like a few days that she's in this horrible situation. She's actually been there for a really long time. And he says to her like this, you know what, this 5 years, you've probably been thinking to yourself, oy vey, why me? Why is this happening to me? It's so terrible. And finally, now it's become very clear to me exactly why this is happening. Like when we read the Megillah, and we've read it every year, we know the end of the story. So it's incredibly obvious to us exactly why she's in that position. But as she's going through it, she hasn't obviously got to the end of the Megillah, because that's chapter 10. We're only up to chapter 4. And so she doesn't know yet what the end of the story is. So he says to her, it's just occurred to me, this is probably exactly why you're here. Obviously there's a plan, and obviously you are meant to be a major player in it. Yeah, the whole plan probably is dependent on you. But let's think a minute. What did we say before? He said to her that the plan's not dependent on her, that actually Hashem's going to be able to save them anyway. So why is he telling her to put her life on the line? Which is it? Is there like a massive plan underway and she's a key player in this plan, in which case she has to act? Or is Hashem going to find another way to save them anyway, in which case why does she have to put her life on the line? And if he is going to save them, like we asked earlier on, then why should she not be saved? Why will she be destroyed? Okay, so those are my questions. Let's see how she replies. So if you weren't convinced by Rashi and the Gemara before that Esther was actually his wife, I think this is the part that really convinces me that she's his wife. The way she responds is very like passive-aggressive wife kind of thing to say. She says to him, go assemble all the Jews who live in Shushan and fast on my behalf. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens will observe the same fast, and then I shall go to the king, though it's contrary to the law, and if I am to perish, I shall perish. Basically, what she says to him is like this: you know what? You asked me to go. I said I didn't think it was a good idea. I still don't think it's a great idea. So I'm just putting it out there. I will go along with it. I'll do what you've said. But if I perish, you're going to feel really bad about it. And you're going to know, you're going to have to say that I was right all along. So I think this is clear evidence that she must have been his wife, because no one else would talk to the God of Hadar like that, right? Okay, so let's carry on and see what happens next in the story. So this actually tells us why she's so reluctant to go. So that was our question from earlier on. There's lives in the balance here. We get that her life is being put at risk, but she's clearly a very special lady. She's a Sadekes. Why does she not put herself out there straight away? Why does she kind of say, I'd rather wait to see if he calls me? So I think this is our answer. So when she says this, go gather all the Jews and we're also going to fast and I'll go into the king, even though it's not according to the custom, you can read it as that's not according to the custom of the palace, that people aren't allowed to just turn up unannounced. But actually, the Gemara and Megillah says, this is not according to my custom, to Esther's custom. Rabbi Abba said, it will not be according to my usual custom. For every day until now, when I submitted myself to Ahasuerus, it was under compulsion. But now I will be submitting myself to him of my own free will. And Esther further said, and if I perish, I perish. What she really meant was, just as I was lost to my father's house, ever since I was brought here, because, I've been trapped here alone, I've been with no family, and so I've been lost to my father's house, so too shall I be lost to you, because after voluntarily having relations with Ahasuerus, I shall be forever forbidden to you. So this is really why she's so reluctant to go. Not only is her physical life at risk by going, her actual marriage is now on the line, because up until this point in halacha, if you are, if there's a case of a rape or something, when you're coerced into a relationship with another person who's not your husband, that's not your fault. You can still go back to your Jewish husband. And until now, every time that she's been taken to Ahasuerus, it's been against her will. She's been schlepped along there, kicking and screaming. But now, what's Mordechai asking her to do? He's asking her to just turn up. She's going to have to turn up unannounced and say, hi, Ahasuerus, I'm here. I'm your wife. And by the way, I have a little favor to ask you. And she's completely voluntarily going there. And so there's no coercion. It's consensual. So what that means is in halacha, she'll never be allowed to go back to her Jewish husband, to Mordechai. So you can imagine that for these 5 horrendous years, she's been thinking to herself, you know what, this is really awful, but she's been, dreaming about the future where somehow she doesn't know how it's going to happen, but I'm sure, there's a plan and I'm here for a reason. And in the end, it will all turn out okay. And this will just be like a horrible memory and we'll put it behind us and I'll be with my Mordechai again. And, things will be good in the world again. But at this moment, she realizes she's going to have to put everything on the line. And if she goes to Achashverosh now to save the Jewish people, then her own life, her own marriage is completely over. She's really stuck there, even according to Jewish law. So how do you think she feels in this moment? She probably, I'd imagine, feels quite conflicted. You can unmute if you have anything to say, by the way, if you want to chime in with any questions or comments, or if you want to tell me how you think she's feeling now.
Sure, even though she's going voluntarily, she's going because she's being told to go rather than because she wants to go. She's going with the attitude, if I die, I'll die. That's her attitude of going to Achashverosh. It's not like, yay, I'm going to Achashverosh. She's right, going grudgingly.
Yeah, she's clearly not keen on going. But I think according to strict halacha, if there's no gun to her head, which there isn't, then she still would have been forbidden to Mordechai.
Even though she's saving the Jewish people.
Even though, yeah.
That's harsh.
It is, I know. It's very sad. When like all our little girls dress up as Esther, I always look at them and think like, why? Why do you want to be Esther? She was really sad. Anyone else? Okay, so we don't actually have to speculate about how she felt at this moment, because luckily for us, she actually composed Tehillim Kaf Beis in this very moment. So she's standing outside the chamber, the inner chamber to Achashverosh's room. She's about to present herself to him, and she's feeling so incredibly upset. And so who does she turn to? She's got no one there with her. She's all alone in the palace. She's got none of her Jewish people, none of her family. So she turns to Hashem. This is quite a well-known Tehillim. It's Ayelet Hashacha, which is attributed to her. And Ayelet was also another name that she was known by. And she says, Kayli, Kayli, lama azov tani, rachog mishuasi divrei shagasi. My God, why have you abandoned me? Why so far from delivering me and from my anguished roaring? So you can hear the pain there. It's not that she's saying I've lost faith, I don't believe in Hashem. She's talking to Hashem. She knows he's there, but she feels completely abandoned and alone in this moment. And then I'm going to skip to the part in red, Yud Aleph. And remember what we said at the beginning about how she never ever had any parents. From the moment of birth, she was an orphan. So who did she rely on? She says to Hashem, I became your charge at birth. From my mother's womb, you have been my God. So she says to him, I never had any parent. You were my guide. Throughout my life, you have been there for me. And yet at this moment, well, I know you're still there, but I can't feel you, and I feel like you've completely abandoned me. It's actually a really nice insight into her relationship with Hashem, because as we know, Hashem's name's not mentioned in the whole Megillah, because he's quite a hidden role. But so we never see any kind of interaction with Esther and Hashem as we do with other Nevi'im and Nevi'os. But this is her moment where she's actually having a really intense conversation with him. So we can tell they are very close.
Why is she despised by people?
Sorry?
Why is she despised by people and mocked and curling their lips and all that kind of thing?
Oh.
What's that referring to?
I don't know. I
All
think
who
that's
see
another
me
share
mock
for another
me.
time. Good question. They curl their lips, they shake their heads. I don't know. Let's do another show on that another time. But great question, Joanna. Haven't looked into it. I can get back to you. Okay, so let's carry on. So she does go to Achashverosh, and eventually, after a couple of little feasts, she asks him to save her and her people. And I think the way she expresses it really sums up her feelings amazingly powerfully, Because remember what we said, that she and Mordechai are part of that generation that they themselves have lived through the Golus. Which Golus are we talking about? The Golus that we know really well, because we read it every year in Eicha, when Yirmiyahu describes what went on when, you know, the city was taken and there was a siege around the city and the people were on the streets and starving and dying and eating their own children. Mordechai, he and his generation were there. So this is like the same generation that experienced all of that are now in this situation where they're about to be destroyed again. I mean, to again put it in contemporary terms, it would be like for us to see a Holocaust survivor with a gun to their heads. So, you know, she was there. Remember, she's not a young girl, she's at least 40. So she's really very strongly absorbed that whole experience of being in Golus. And not only that, this night that she's about to go into Achashverosh is actually the first night of Pesach, when normally, you know, like us, they celebrated Pesach as well. Normally she would be sitting around her Yom Tov table with all of her family, supposed to be rejoicing in our redemption, but yet again, this generation, they're living through a Golus. How can you celebrate Pesach that you've been redeemed when you've literally been through a Golus, and even whilst you're in your current Golus, you're again about to be destroyed by, you know, another threat? It's such a poignant moment. And you can imagine, so she's been to the same way as we listen to Eicha every year, and it's a really familiar tune to us. So she's lived through every Tisha B'Av that's ever been, or at least 40 years of it. And every year they would read Eicha just like we do, because Yirmiyahu wrote it at the time of the destruction. And what word does she describe to, what word does she use to describe how she's feeling at this moment? She says, Eicha, because it completely sums up for her exactly how she's feeling. And we read this part in the Eicha tune, and I like to think that that's how they read it, how she says it as well, because this tune actually existed from then. So she says like this: Ki Eicha chal chal v'ra'isi bara'a sheyem sa'es ami ve'eicha chal chal v'ra'isi b'avdam aladati. She says, for how can I bear to see the disaster which will befall my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred? So she uses the word Eicha to convey exactly how she's feeling, because for her, even though the night itself is Pesach, and even though she's in the middle of the Purim story, for her, this night is Eicha, this is Tisha B'Av, because whatever happens to her, she knows she's doomed to a life of misery. But on the other hand, how can she stand by and let this happen to her people again? And remember, at this moment, we know the ending. Yeah, we've had this story every year, we've read to the end, and we know that she actually does save the Jewish people, and that she is a key player, and that she does have to go to Achashverosh, and that she is the one to save them. But she doesn't know in that moment if she's risking everything for nothing. She doesn't even know if it's going to work. She could walk into the room and he straight away chops her head off, and then she dies and nothing comes of it. She also doesn't know that we're going to be talking about her and praising her heroism for generations to come, and that she'll be famous for what she does for us in this moment, and that we're all going to name our children after her and dress up as her on Purim, that she's going to become the heroine of the story. She's just a person at this point. She doesn't know what's going to happen. So how does she decide what to do when everything's on the line for her, not just her own physical life, but her personal life, her private life, her marriage? It's all about to disappear. How does she decide what to do? So there's this well-known story told about a Rav called Rav Simcha Bunim of Peshischa, that he always walked around with 2 pieces of paper in his pocket. And in one pocket, he had a piece of paper saying, Bishvili Nivra Ha'olam, that the world was created for me. And in the other pocket, he has a piece of paper saying, Ani Ofav Efer. So that means I am dust and ashes. So whenever he was feeling too arrogant or too overconfident, he'd look at his Ani Ofav Efer and think to himself, okay, you're not so important, you're just dust and ashes. But whenever he was feeling like he was insignificant, or like he wasn't good enough to do something, or maybe somebody else could do a better job of it, he'd refer to his Bishvili Nivra Ha'olam paper. And actually this idea of Bishvili Nivra Ha'olam comes from a Gemara where they're talking about a man who's on trial for his life because he's been accused of a capital crime, and they're discussing whether or not you can believe the witnesses and whether or not he should be put to death. And they use this expression. They say, that every person is obliged to say, the world was created for me, and as one person can be the source of all humanity and recognize the significance of his actions. So the idea is that, you know, sometimes you're in a moment where it is completely key. You're literally, you know, the world is on the brink of destruction, and that's your moment. Like, that's what you're here for, and you're completely essential. So let's go back to our 2 questions from earlier. So Mordechai says to Esther, don't imagine that you, of all the Jews, will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. On the contrary, if you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, while you and your father's house will perish. And who knows, perhaps you've attained a royal position for just such a crisis. So suddenly now, the meaning of this becomes clear, because Mordechai says to her, who knows if it's for this very moment that you're in this situation? But on the other hand, we'll be fine without you. But if you do nothing, you and your father's house will be destroyed. So now we can understand what he's talking about. If in that very moment, when you're deciding whether or not to do something, and that's something that you're deciding whether or not to do, is your whole reason for existence, then if you don't do it, then what was the point of your life? Your life becomes completely meaningless and worthless. What was the point of your existence? You and your father's house will perish. He's saying, yes, the Jewish people will be fine regardless, will always survive. We're not going to miss out on being saved, but you will be missing out on being the one that saves us. And I think life's like a continuous series of these moments and opportunities when sometimes we think to ourselves that we're not good enough, or maybe somebody else could do it better than us. It's not always a life or death situation. Sometimes it's just on a very mundane level. You know, how often do you see a message on a WhatsApp group, you know, someone's asking for help with something, or they need a meal for a meal rota, or there's a chesed opportunity, and none of us are horrible people. We don't say to ourselves, oh no, I'm not going to do that, I really don't want to do that. Or we don't say, I don't have time for that. What do we say to ourselves? We say, I do this a lot. It's not just you, it's me as well. I say to myself, you know, I'll just wait a bit and see if somebody else offers. You know, I'll give other people the opportunity to have the mitzvah. Don't want to hog all the mitzvahs. Or you say to yourself, you know, I'll log into the meal rota a bit later. And then lo and behold, when you log in later, the whole meal rota is full. And you're like, phew, they got all their meals and I didn't need to cook one, but they didn't miss out. So I don't need to feel bad. But you don't realize they still got the help they needed, or they still got their meal. They're not missing out, but you don't realize that you're the one who's missed out on becoming a better you in that moment, because really your whole existence is the sum total of all of your decisions and experiences. So in this moment, Esther gives up everything. At the end of the Megillah, when we all go home and we're singing Shir Shamas Yaakov, and we're like getting ready our Suda for the next day and everything, getting our Shachmanas ready, you know, the Megillah ends, but actually she's still in the story. She's still stuck married to Achashverosh, and she's still forbidden to her husband Mordechai, but she has a son. Her son is called Daryavesh. She has a son with Achashverosh, and he is the king who sends the Jews back to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash, and that was all in her merit. So the point of all this is not to turn Purim into a sad story, because it definitely is a happy story, and we should celebrate it. I don't think Esther wants us to be sad for her. I don't think she was like moping away. I think looking back at that moment, I think she probably felt like a real sense of satisfaction and a sense of empowerment when she thought, you know, I gave everything up, but look what I've achieved. And, you know, sometimes everything you do counts, but also everything you don't do counts. So when deciding whether or not to do something, let's not think maybe somebody else could do a better job of it, or maybe I'll do it when I have more time, because there's never any more time. Like, none of us ever have any time to do anything. So you need to reach into your pocket for your Bishvili Nivra Ha'olam paper and remember that you are the only you in existence. And you've got certain things that only you in your uniqueness can achieve. And you never know how many people are going to be reading about you in years to come, and all of your great achievements and all your great moments where you stepped up and took a challenge when you weren't sure whether you should or not. So that's it from me. I'm going to stop screen sharing. If anyone wants to unmute and ask anything or say anything, then feel free.
What about Mordechai? Did he have any children? Because didn't his house perish by the virtue of the fact he didn't have any kids?
Yeah, I don't believe he did ever have any kids. But the nice bit of the story is that they're actually buried together. So even though they never got back together as husband and wife, they are buried together in a cave in Iran. Because actually, going back to my original story, Iran is Persia.
Mhm.
So he really was Ayatollah Khomeini almost.
Yeah.
Anyone else want to ask anything, say anything?
Go on. I can't be the only one who has questions. You know you want to ask.
Okay, well, in that case, thanks everyone for coming. And it was very nice to see all of you. Well, at least see your names on the screen, even if I didn't see your faces.
Thank you, Shira.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
so
So
much.
interesting.
Thank you.
Shira. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks
Wish
a
you
lot.
Very good Purim. Pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Shira.
Bye.
You really made her come alive, Shira. Thank you.
Oh,
You
pleasure.
know, I really
I think it's a
enjoyed
very
that.
interesting perspective. I certainly hadn't thought of it at all like that.
You
And
make
now
the
it's
Torah
sad for her.
characters real. That's what you do. You make them like real people that you could talk to today. I think that's really important.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Okay, good night, everyone. Nice to see you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shira. See you.